Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia had the world convinced that it had the second strongest military in the world, inferior only to the United States. But as the dust of the war settled, it became increasingly clear that the mighty bear was merely a paper tiger. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, said it the best in a speech in Finland. The Kremlin often claimed it had the second strongest military in the world, and many believed it. Today, many see Russia's military as the second strongest in Ukraine. A case study in failure, that's how Blinken labeled the Russians, and the country's equipment, technology, leadership, troops, strategy, tactics, and morale. Increasingly, these aspects of the Russian military Blinken singled out almost perfectly match the very reasons Russia's military is weaker than you think. The reasons we'll discuss in this video. But before diving into these critical factors, let's examine how the illusion of a mighty Russian military might be constructed. The explanation is simple. It's all about appearances. Many people view the Russian military as the successor to the Soviet war machine, a force of sheer numbers and unyielding might. Remember, the Soviet Union was the one to spend over 20% of its gross domestic product, GDP, during the Cold War era to keep up with the image of a military colossus that could crush any adversary through sheer attrition and brutal efficiency. But appearances can be deceiving, and as the vestige of the Soviet legacy, Russia inherited more than just the image. It also inherited the underlying weaknesses. The weakness has now been exposed for the world to see, as the brittle core of the Russian military, previously masked by hollow bravado, cracked and crumbled when put to the test in Ukraine. So let's inspect each of these cracks that have caused the facade of the Russian military to crumble under the weight of its own overestimation. The first crack is arguably the most obvious. The Russian military has simply lost too many troops in Ukraine, weakening the very fiber of its operational readiness. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost as many as 561,400 troops between February 24, 2022 and July 16, 2024. That's more than 500,000 soldiers in a little over 2 years. The last time such devastating losses were seen was during World War II, when nations mobilized on an unprecedented scale. But in June 2024, Russia's President Vladimir Putin said that almost 700,000 Russian troops were fighting in Ukraine. So how weak can the Russian military possibly be, even after all these heavy losses? Well, first of all, does anyone really believe Putin's claims anymore, after they've been proven wrong time and again? But for argument's sake, let's say those figures aren't grossly overestimated. This begs the question, where are all these troops coming from? Because the Russian military casualties are very much real, and the country's armed forces comprised roughly 900,000 troops and officers before the invasion, so something definitely doesn't add up. The element missing in this calculation is conscription. In August 2022, Putin signed a decree to increase the number of Russian troops by 137,000. In December 2023, he ordered another 170,000 fighters to be added. If Sergei Shoigu, the now sacked long-standing Minister of Defense, is to be believed, almost 490,000 contract soldiers and volunteers joined the army in 2023 alone. Though he presents these figures through a lens of heroism and dedication, they probably have more to do with the generous pay and benefits offered to attract recruits. Namely, it's been reported that the Russian contract troops are paid at least 210,000 rubles per month, approximately $2,300, to fight Putin's war. That's over 3 times more than the average Russian salary, which was 71,419 rubles in July 2023. So it's possible that Russia does have the numbers when it comes to troops. But as you'll soon learn, numbers are all the country has. You see, many of the Russian military's most elite personnel perished in the opening weeks of the full-scale conflict in Ukraine. The new conscripts can in no way replace the expertise and battle-hardened experience of those troops, especially not when they're only conscripted for a year, most of which they spend in training. However, the more troops died in Ukraine, the shorter this training period and the more desperate Russian mobilization efforts became. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW for short, reported that Russia even tried to draft new troops inside Ukraine by conducting a door-to-door mobilization effect in Kadivka and forcing residents of Luhansk into joining the military through extortion and threats. And that's on top of the 100,000 dangerous prison inmates Russia freed to fight in Ukraine and the many ill-prepared draftees in Putin's partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists. Drafting these reservists was such a huge mistake that even Putin admitted to it during a video call with his advisors, expressing his regret for drafting individuals with chronic illnesses, people too old to fight, and fathers with children. But this regret will do little to mitigate the severe consequences of such hasty and flawed mobilization efforts and appease the growing discontent within Russian troops. especially as it's becoming more evident that Russia still treats its troops as the Soviet Union treated the T-34 tank during World War II, as expendable assets. The T-34 was cheap to build, which allowed the Red Army to mass-produce them and send them to be destroyed. Similarly, Russia continues to send its soldiers into harm's way without any regard for their safety, seeing them as nothing more than pawns. In both cases, it seems that the prevailing sentiment was and is, hey, we can always get some more. As you can expect, this willingness to sacrifice Russian lives and conduct attrition warfare at a cost no Western country would ever accept hasn't really made the Russian troops fond of their service of their mission. This brings us to the second crack in the facade of the Russian military: the exceedingly low morale, fueled by a sense of expendability, the outright horrific treatment by the government, and the grim realities of war. In August 2023, a small group of Russian soldiers stationed in the Kherson region recorded a video in which they described their morale as being below floor level. According to the independent media organization translating war materials into English, War Translated, which shared and obviously translated the video, these soldiers complained about being sent to the first line of defense without proper training, air support, artillery support, and without heavy equipment. This video is on par with the November 2022 assessment by the ISW, which indicated that the morale and psychological state of Russian forces in the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts were exceedingly low, due to high losses on the battlefield, troop desertion, and inadequate preparation for battle. All things considered, it shouldn't be surprising that the abuse of methamphetamines and other drugs is on the rise among the Russian military, according to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, a US government-funded media organization. The horrible treatment that caused such catastrophic consequences is also part of the third crack in the Russian military's perceived strength: the sheer lack of battlefield tactics and strategic foresight. So far, the only tactic the Russian forces have heavily relied on was the infamous meat grinder strategy. This strategy is exactly what it sounds like. Ill-prepared and ill-equipped troops are sent in en masse into combat in an effort to overwhelm the Ukrainian front lines. There's no regard for casualties or strategic objectives, the sheer unfiltered aggression akin to feeding soldiers directly into the relentless meat grinder of battle. At first glance, this approach can make the Russian army appear formidable in its unyielding push forward. But upon closer inspection, it becomes clear this army is virtually gaining no ground while suffering devastating losses. A similar approach can be seen across all the other theaters. It seems that Russia is hell-bent on completely obliterating Ukraine, but in reality, it's only eroding its own military strength. The heavy losses in the military equipment department only further prove this. These losses also represent another reason why Russia's military is much weaker than you think: the fourth crack. According to the July 16th report by the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces, Russia has lost the following equipment since the invasion began: 8,227 tanks, 15,862 armored fighting vehicles, 20,680 vehicles and fuel tanks, 15,368 artillery systems, 1,119 multiple launch rocket systems, 892 air defense systems, 361 airplanes, 326 helicopters, 12,193 drones, 28 ships and boats, and 1 submarine. Those are heavy losses for the military that was supposed to crush Kyiv in a few days, as was initially planned. Russia might have started the war with an overwhelming number of weapons and equipment, but most of these were soon proven to be far inferior to their Western-made counterparts. Take the Kamov Ka-52 attack helicopter, nicknamed the Alligator, as an example. Before the invasion, military experts considered the Ka-52 as one of the most capable aircraft of its kind. This twin-seat helicopter is an immensely upgraded form of the original Kamov Ka-50 Black Shark aircraft, which used a single-seat cockpit. Thanks to the upgrades, the Ka-52 is billed as a platform able to take on various roles, including assault, close air support, convoy protection, and armed patrols. All of this while retaining a maximum speed of nearly 190 miles per hour, a cruising speed of nearly 160 miles per hour, a ferry range of almost 700 miles, a combat radius of 285 miles, and an operational service ceiling of 18,000 feet. And yet the supposedly inferior Ukrainian forces have managed to down over 80 of these $16 million worth combat helicopters, which is reportedly half of the Russian total Ka-52 fleet. It is a case study in failure. The almost effortless destruction of the Ka-52 helicopters made the retired US Army General Ben Hodges question the competence of the entire Russian military, including the equipment and the personnel in charge of it. After a Ka-52 was shot down in the Zaporizhia region by the 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade and the incident captured on video, Hodges stated that the Russian pilot clearly lacked the skills to fly his attack helicopter. But incompetence in the Russian military doesn't stop there. It goes all the way to the top, to the military leadership itself, which makes for the fifth crack in Russia's perceived military might. Chaos, dysfunction, corruption. Call it what you will, any of those words best capture the state of Russian military leadership today. Although truthfully, this has always been the case with the Russian top brass, but the invasion of Ukraine showed just how rotten the core of the Russian military hierarchy truly is. The event that single-handedly proved this was the firing of Sergei Shoigu, who held the position of Russian defense minister for 12 years. Though this move was anticipated for some time, it was still shocking given how close Shoigu was to Putin. So why did Putin decide to boot his longtime confidant? Well, there are a few possible reasons for this highly consequential decision, including the overall poor performance of the Russian military in Ukraine and his personal feud with Yevgeny Prigozhin, the late head of the Wagner Group, which culminated in the infamous June 2023 Wagner rebellion. However, the primary reason why Shoigu had to go was his reported involvement in embezzlement schemes. As The Diplomat, an international online magazine covering politics in the Indo-Pacific region, puts it, the present-day weakness also shows what happens when you let one person, Sergei Shoigu, steal most of the defense budget. So if the one person whose job it is to ensure military readiness and capability only cares about lining his own pockets, how strong can that military truly be? The answer is painfully clear, not strong at all. Shoigu's departure isn't just a change in leadership, it's an indictment of a system riddled with corruption and incompetence, a system that has failed its soldiers and its nation. Another aspect that has failed the Russian military, leaving it vulnerable and exposed, is the state-run defense industry, aka the sixth reason why Russia's military is weaker than initially thought. This industry, once a symbol of Soviet power, has now become a relic of inefficiency and outdated technology. Plagued by mismanagement and corruption, it can no longer produce the advanced weaponry and equipment necessary to sustain a modern military force. Instead of innovation, there's stagnation. Instead of strength, there's vulnerability. This decrepit system has failed to keep pace with global advancements, leaving Russia's military exposed and underprepared for the challenges of contemporary warfare. Sure, Putin has recently ramped up the defense industry significantly, producing numerous artillery rounds, missiles, and drones, but the damage has already been done. The years of neglect and corruption can't be undone overnight. The new production may bolster numbers, but it can't mask the underlying weakness. However, even this so-called new production isn't always exactly new. What do we mean by that? Well, there's simply not enough time to produce new weapons at the rate Russia wants and, let's face it, needs. So the industry has resorted to dipping into its Soviet-era stocks and cannibalizing old equipment to keep up appearances. This is also the seventh and last crack in Russia's facade of strength, which has crumbled under scrutiny. In a way, the final reason why Russia's military is weaker than you think is the same as the first reason we mentioned. Sure, Russia might have exorbitant numbers of troops on paper, but these troops are poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and lacking in morale, a stark contrast to the elite units once boasted of by the Kremlin. Similarly, Russia might brag about high production figures, such as the reported 2,100 tanks manufactured in 2023, ranging from T-55 to T-62 to the latest T-90. But how many of these tanks have been taken out of storage, minimally refurbished, and sent to get destroyed on the battlefield? Quite a few, according to the Swedish Defense Research Agency. The same agency estimated that Russia produced only 520 new tanks in 2023, including 62 T-90M Proyevs, 62 T-90 T-90As, 80 T-80 BVMs, 140 T-72 B3s, and 140 T-72 B3Ms. So Russia might still have ungodly quantities of weapons and equipment, but these are subpar at best, bound to fail in modern combat. To make matters worse for Russia, these stocks can't last forever. In fact, they will only last to mid-2025, according to recent projections by a Ukrainian intelligence and analytical platform with a name that roughly translates to the military fortune teller. Naturally, the vehicles from these stocks, built during the Soviet Union's industrial heyday, can't be replaced with new production, which signifies more than just a logistical challenge. It represents a fundamental crisis in Russia's defense capability. For this reason, many experts believe that the Russian military is running out of time in Ukraine. However, even with all these weaknesses, military experts aren't quick to write off the Russian military for a few reasons. One, Russia has demonstrated an outright shocking ability to adapt and innovate in response to challenges. 2. Russia's weaknesses are far from the only factor necessary for Ukraine to prevail. And 3. A weak Russia is still very much dangerous globally, perhaps even more, as a wounded animal is known to be unpredictable and violent. But what do you think? Is this the beginning of the end for the Russian military, or is it merely a temporary setback? And if Ukraine is to capitalize on all these weaknesses, how should it go about it? Share your thoughts in the comments section below.